Welcome back to the Judo Wall. I'm Dennis Jones, and today I'm going to talk to you about preventing fraud on your mobile application or mobile website. Fraud is an unfortunate side effect of accepting cards. Across the entire industry of card-not-present transactions, the average fraud rate is about half a percentage point, or 50 basis points of the entire transaction volume taken ends up being lost. And that varies by industry, but in every situation, it's very important that when you begin thinking about accepting card payments, you start also thinking about how to prevent fraud. Now at Judo, we have a number of custom solutions that we have built for mobile in particular. And the reason you need to think about mobile from a fraud perspective differently is because on a mobile device, you're generally sitting behind either your carrier's server or public Wi-Fi. And that means one of the key elements of identifying fraudsters online, which is around IP address, is lost. So let's take a step back, and we've talked to you earlier about some of the most simple ways of protecting against fraud. There's a method called address verification service. What that essentially is doing is helping you identify whether the cardholder's address that they've entered onto your application matches with the one that's stored with the bank. And again, unfortunately, that has some false positives. Where the database hasn't been kept up to speed. Another method is called 3D Secure, which we've talked about before. And 3D Secure, while very helpful, really drops conversion on a mobile device. So let's start thinking about fraud prevention differently. Because the reality is on mobile, we have a computer in our pocket. And it means that we can make transactions even more secure than chip and pin transactions. In Judo's view of the world, we're going to see mobile-based payments becoming the preferential way of paying. The terminal will go away because we can make transactions more secure with all that information. So after you've done some sort of basic fraud checking, you've got to think about how am I going to validate three pieces of information. One is this card valid? The second is, does the person who's using this card have the right to use this card? Right? And then the third is this person a risk in general or a credit risk in general? So the first, is this card valid, is a basic processing communication. You'll send that data down through someone like Judo or any gateway, and they'll get a response back from the issuing bank saying, yes, that's a valid card. That's the easiest box to check. Next, when you're trying to validate, is this card in possession of the person who's trying to make the purchase? And that's where AVS and 3D Secure come into play. But let's get a little bit smarter about thinking about how can we validate this. And that's when you want to think about your customer's journey with your app. Some of the most interesting and effective fraud prevention solutions that we've worked with our partners on are ones where you're thinking outside of the box. So here behind me, I've talked about three different journeys that are specific to apps and how you can use the data within that journey in order to help prevent fraud. And in Judo systems, we're able to use all sorts of these different data points as we consult with you in order to prevent fraud. So one great example is a taxi app. Unfortunately, taxi apps have attracted a high volume of fraud. Because it's basically free money. You can immediately get in a cab, you get out of the cab, you're gone, there's no trail, and you've delivered a service that's instant. Well, in the journey of a taxi app, there's a few steps you have to take. When you register with a taxi app, they always need to get your phone number. And the reason they need to get the phone number from a customer journey perspective is so that when the taxi driver shows up, they can get in touch with you. Well, when you do that validation on the phone number, what most folks do is they work with a service like Nexmo in order to send an SMS back and forth and validate that the phone number that was entered is the phone number that's going to be used for that taxi. Well, in the background, what services can do, like with Judo, is we can use that phone number to go and ask the carrier, is this a pay-as-you-go phone? Is this a contract phone? And essentially get a mini credit score on that customer real time. And so in conjunction with doing that step, you've prevented fraud. You've identified, is this a good credit risk customer? Now, if that comes back and it says it's a pay-as-you-go phone and it's only been used for a couple of days, that's not going to tell you that you definitely don't want to take that ride. But maybe it'll tell you that the maximum you're willing to use with that customer is 20 pounds. Or maybe it delivers a warning back to the app that tells the driver, make sure you validate this card holder. Again, it's thinking through that journey and when you can get different pieces of data. So let's take a different example of something that's pretty interesting and a little bit scary. We work with a lot of companies that do postcard apps or any sort of picture app where you can easily from the palm of your hand send a picture anywhere in the world. Well, in the course of that process, you almost always need to get access to the customer's contacts. We've used a little location symbol there. Let's assume it's contacts for a second. And you need those contacts because you're sending that postcard to someone in your phone. And so part of that registration process with the app, you're going to ask for the right to access the contacts. It's already become part of the process. Well, what systems like Judo can do is go in and look at those contacts and run an algorithm against those contacts as part of the transaction. You don't want to ever store that information or take that information or do anything with it. That's a clear violation of Data Protection Act. But as long as you're doing it with the transaction, you can find out things like, well, how many contacts does this person have on their phone? How many are associated with pictures? How many are associated with more data like a email address? How frequently has this person contacted different folks on that phone? Because a fraudster is probably going to use that phone once or twice and then burn it. And so the use of contacts and their interaction with them is a good indication of this is a real person sitting on the other side of that. So then with something like a shopping app, there's different pieces of information that you're going to get. You need their address because you need to send materials back to them. So in this instance, AVS makes a lot of sense. You're already capturing that information and it helps decrease the risk of that transaction. At some point, it's going to ship to that address. Well, maybe if it's a very high value item, you need to get an ID from that person. Maybe as part of the credit card transaction on delivery, that person needs to show their credit card. Again, those aren't great examples on a shopping cart situation. But the key is thinking about what's that customer journey look like? Where am I already getting information? And how can I use that information to ensure that I'm dealing with a real person who's using a real card and that person is allowed to use that card? Once you tie those three pieces of information together, you're going to eliminate or get very close to eliminating fraud on your mobile app. Thank you for joining today. If you have any questions about our fraud solutions, please don't hesitate to get in touch.